You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 14th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, we hear the latest as a UN aid worker is killed in an attack in Rafah, the first of a UN foreign aid worker in Gaza since the start of the conflict. Also coming up, Britain charges 3 men suspected of spying for Hong Kong's intelligence service. Nina Dos Santos is here to tell us more. Nina.
Yes, that's right, Emma. We're talking about 3 individuals. One of them is a UK Border Force officer based at Heathrow, another one active in the same sort of space. And this will obviously continue to gain headlines because these individuals will be back in court on May the 24th. So far, they haven't entered a plea.
Thank you, Nina. Plus,
it's not understood worldwide that 2/3 of people who flee because of violence and conflict, they remain within their own country. It's not true that everybody is fleeing to Europe or to other Western countries.
We'll hear more on where the number of internally displaced people is hitting record levels around the world. And after Russia's bombardment of Ukraine's power infrastructure, Kyiv is forced to import energy. We'll explore the cost in every sense. Plus a roundup of the latest arts news, and we head to Cannes for a preview of the film festival. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The Prime Minister of Georgia has vowed that a controversial so-called Foreign Agents Bill will be passed by the country's parliament today. The US is expected to announce fresh trade tariffs on China, targeting areas such as electric cars, solar equipment and semiconductors. And the European Union has lodged an official complaint with the organisers, of the Eurovision Song Contest after audience members were banned from waving the bloc's flag at last Saturday's final. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Israeli troops have renewed their operations in the north of Gaza. The country's military have returned to a part of the Strip where they had previously claimed to have dismantled Hamas' command structure. It's raised questions about just how effective its campaign has been, with more than 30,000 people now dead and Hamas top leaders still seemingly in position. Meanwhile, at least one United Nations worker has been killed and another injured after a vehicle marked as belonging to the agency was attacked in Rafah yesterday. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by the journalist Ruth Michelson, who's been following developments. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning, Emma.
So let's begin with this death of the aid worker. It's a vehicle that was marked as belonging to the agency. It was attacked in Rafah, and it is, as far as we know, the first of a UN foreign aid worker since October the 7th.
Yes, I mean, it's worth mentioning that almost 200 UN aid workers have been killed in Gaza since October. But this is the first time that, according to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that an international aid worker has been killed, or from the UN rather, has been killed in Gaza. We know that their car was struck as it travelled to the European hospital in Rafah, and that this was a staff member from the UN Department of Safety and Security, and that there was also a Palestinian aid worker that was with them that was wounded.
So we have the deputy spokesman for the UN Security Council saying that they were targeted while travelling in a United Nations vehicle clearly marked with the UN flag and insignias. So there is no doubt about what they were doing. But the Farhan Haq did not say it was either the Israelis or Hamas who were responsible for it.
That's true. I mean, I think we've already seen since October a long discussion over what deconfliction means, so that there are aid groups that will provide their whereabouts, their movements to the Israeli forces, and that we have seen, as with the attack that killed 7 humanitarian aid workers from World Central Kitchen a couple of months ago, that this deconfliction mechanism has not. There have been major problems that they have proven we've seen these huge problems with this deconfliction mechanism, that World Central Kitchen essentially said that they had provided information about their whereabouts to the Israelis, and that one battalion had gotten this information and another one hadn't. And now with what's happening on the ground in Rafah, that we are seeing the renewal of this again with the expansion of fighting there, that not only is this cutting off the supply of aid through the Rafah crossing, that aid groups are unable to deliver aid through the Rafah crossing, and Kerem Shalom also seems to be closed. But now that we're seeing the deaths of aid workers, strikes on aid workers' vehicles while they're operating there.
And we've also had reports coming in the last 24 hours that there's a group of American medical workers at the European hospital in Khan Yunis. They're trapped in Gaza, according to a State Department spokesperson. It does, you're talking about the difficulties that those who are trying to work in Gaza, trying to help, are experiencing. Absolutely. I mean, it is regarded as one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a humanitarian right now, also to be a journalist. And then now we are adding on to this the fact that with the closure of the crossings, this means that no fuel is getting in. It means that personnel, international personnel, can't leave and return. And the lack of fuel means that aid organizations that are operating there, they might not be able to continue operations, they've said. This means that hospitals there will shut down. And this is adding an already huge burden to the medical staff that are there, who are talking about having worked for months and months in the worst conditions imaginable without any opportunity to have a break. And now, while also being, in many cases, displaced multiple times themselves. I mean, the current figures are that well over 300,000 people, as many as 360,000 people, have now been displaced from Rafah. That has been the center of the aid response so far. And that means this displacement has also meant the forced evacuation of a number of major hospitals there. And that also means the medical staff that staff those hospitals. Let's move on to the military operation by Israel. It started on Saturday, this renewed fighting in the north of the area. This now means that we have some of the most intense fighting in both the north and the south of the Gaza Strip for weeks on end.
That is true. I mean, we've seen that Israeli forces have renewed attacks on Jabalia in the north. And that now they are also have said that they're expanding operations in Rafah in the south, that there has been this increased push to demand that people flee. So we have seen over 360,000 people who have fled Rafah. And there is a discussion about what this expansion of Israeli forces in Rafah means. There are reports of tanks on the ground. There's a huge expansion of their presence there. And overnight, the Biden administration has been talking about what they've described as troop movements that indicate that Israel could further expand their operations in Rafah. But this is according to NBC, that the White House hasn't made a formal assessment about whether a full-blown invasion of Rafah is imminent.
Indeed. I mean, the US, the last thing that we've heard is the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying that an Israeli operation in Rafah would be a mistake and that they are urgently working towards a ceasefire. But in the wider context here, Ruth, we have this operation returning to the north, and obviously we have this intended operation in the south. It does raise the question about what Israel's intention here is, because Hamas's leaders are still in position, and Israel had said that it had eradicated Hamas, or it had a successful operation in the north of the Gaza Strip. It doesn't appear to be going Israel's way.
Well, we've certainly seen for some time that as there's been continued fighting in the north, including, just to name one example, the repeated siege on Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, when the Israelis launched that operation, they said that this was just to deal with pockets of Hamas fighters that were still present there. But then the numbers that they gave for Hamas fighters that they alleged that they either killed or captured from that hospital were in the hundreds. So, I mean, going back to what you said, that the way that the Israeli authorities have spoken about what is happening in Gaza is that they've said that their objective is to completely destroy Hamas. There is very little indication that this has been successful, or that the expansion of fighting or the different areas of fighting are achieving those aims. What it is doing is causing an enormous loss of human life, causing the mass displacement of people. And that's why we're seeing this concern from the White House that expanded operations in Rafah are not necessarily going to achieve anything different to what we've seen in other parts of Gaza, where now, as you say, fighting is now going on again.
Just briefly, let's touch on the opening of a new crossing into Gaza in coordination with the United States. And there is a suggestion from Israel that it wants the Palestinian Authority to send representatives to the Rafah crossing to take part in operating it, although not in official capacity. This is, by all accounts, the first time the Israelis have introduced the Palestinian Authority into the scope of operations. What do you think that suggests?
I mean, I think we can say that, when we've seen how Israel deals with the Palestinian Authority elsewhere, particularly in the West Bank, which the Palestinian Authority administers there, at the moment we have Israeli officials, the finance minister Smotrich, for example, talking about how proud he is to have cut off tax revenue to the Palestinian Authority. So Israel has always shown that they have a desire to control what the Palestinian Authority does, that they believe that they can introduce them as a force to, in this case, because they're not Hamas. But I mean, in practical terms, it's not. There's very few guarantees that the Palestinian Authority will agree to do this because of how the Israelis have treated them in the West Bank. So, I mean, in terms of how this plan is likely to work, at the moment, the news that we're getting from both Rafah and from Kerem Shalom is that the UN has inspected these crossings and have tried to check for things like unexploded ordnance, and it's really not clear whether it's safe for anybody to be present in that area. So questions about who is going to be able to administer this crossing feel quite remote, given what the situation is like at these crossings on the ground due to the presence of Israeli forces.
Ruth Michelson, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're with Monocle Radio. (14:13 in Beijing, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, the UK's Prime Minister used a speech on security to warn of growing threats to the UK from what he called an axis of authoritarian states, including China. In a separate, unrelated event, 3 men, including a former Royal Marine and an employee of the UK Border Force, have appeared in court in London, charged with spying for Hong Kong's intelligence service. And Amnesty International has released a report saying Hong Kong and Chinese individuals in a number of Western countries have been secretly filmed as part of a pattern of intimidation by Beijing. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and a former CNN Europe editor. Very good morning. Welcome back, Nina.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Emma.
Just tell us, who are these men and what are they charged with?
Well, there's 3 of them, aged between 37 years old and another individual in his mid-60s. Let's start out with Chi Leung, 38 years old, from Staines. That's a suburb of London near Heathrow Airport. He is, as you pointed out in your introduction there, UK Border Force officer, and he's also a special constable for the City of London Police Force. He's a joint UK, Hong Kong, UK and Chinese national, and he's the founder of a security company called D5 Security, which claims that it has 20 years experience in the British military and the private security sector. There's another private security consultant of a similar age who's been charged as well here. His name is Matthew Trickett. He's from Maidenhead, which is again in the similar area outside of London near Heathrow. Currently an immigration officer and also has a history as a Royal Marine. And then there's Chung Ben-Yuen, who's 63 years old, from East London. He's a retired police officer who currently works as a manager at the Hong Kong Economic Trade Office in London. So 3 individuals here, they didn't enter a plea. They only spoke to confirm their names and addresses when they appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court here in London, not far from our studios where we are at the moment. But they will be reappearing in court on May the 24th.
Now, they've been charged under the National Security Act, haven't they?
Yeah.
What is the penalty if found guilty here?
Well, the National Security Act was described as a game changer by the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, who himself has been extremely vocal about Chinese activities on UK soil for a number of years. It was introduced a couple of years ago, and it's essentially given the UK authorities a lot more power in tackling any sort of allegations of malign influence by those types of autocratic states that, as you were pointing out, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, called out in a big speech that he made just yesterday. When it comes to the charge of assisting a foreign state as part of that National Security Act, it carries a penalty of 14 years potentially in terms of a prison sentence and also a fine. And there have been a lot of cases where this National Security Act has been deployed by the authorities last year. There were 11 people charged under it just in 2023.
Tell us a little bit more about how Beijing has reacted. They have issued a statement. They have responded.
That's right, via their embassy here in London, which is customary, and it is a customarily terse but strongly worded statement. They say that they strongly condemn what they call the UK's unwarranted accusations against the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's government. But, you know, the real issue here is that this is yet another case that has come to the courts here, as I was saying before, charged under these National Security Acts in the UK. And the broader context is that we've also seen other people charged on allegations of spying in the UK. Remember, there was a parliamentary researcher who was charged last year, and another individual. They appeared in court just a couple of months ago as well. And, you know, China has also attracted headlines over the last couple of months in places like Germany as well, because people have been arrested on charges of espionage there too. So very much China on the radar of authorities. When it comes to the broader context of Hong Kong, now that is particularly important here, because remember that the UK handed back Hong Kong back in 1997 after a 99-year lease, and that was on the proviso from Beijing that they'd keep a sort of so-called one country, two systems approach. This was the idea that, you know, Hong Kong would be able to avail itself of its relative freedoms and keep its economic freedoms and democratic freedoms as well, but that has been rolled back quite significantly ever since, culminating in protests in 2020, and since then China has moved to impose various national security laws that are viewed as very draconian inside Hong Kong. First of all, it was the national security law. Then that was recently beefed up with another type of national security law called Article 23. These are the laws that are seeing Jimmy Lai, the publisher of Apple Daily, behind bars at the moment as his trial is going on. And this crackdown has caused more than 100,000 Hong Kongers to come to the UK under schemes that the UK has rolled out called the BNO scheme. There's a lot of pressure from China hawks inside the government and on the backbenches as well to try and push for these schemes to be widened to allow more Hong Kongers to get sanctuary in the UK.
That said, let's touch briefly on what Amnesty International has said in its report, talking about Hong Kong and Chinese individuals in a number of Western countries, including the United Kingdom, who've been secretly filmed as part of a pattern of intimidation by Beijing. I mean, you have met students here in London who have had the most extraordinary experiences of intimidation.
Absolutely. One of them in particular, who fled from Hong Kong, talked about and showed me videos of himself being followed by masked people, particularly around the time of after the lockdown, when people were still able to wear masks without really, in an inconspicuous fashion, being followed around Parliament, particular cars driving around his neighbourhood, following him down the street. One of them claimed that, he spotted and filmed a drone outside of his window over the River Thames. There are others who say that they have been, harassed beaten up during, events taking place in Chinatown in London. And then, of course, you remember that a couple of years ago, there was the incident outside the consulate in Manchester where Bob Chan, another Hong Konger, was trying to demonstrate and appeared to be beaten up by security officials and dragged temporarily inside the consulate territory through the gates, which obviously, could have severe diplomatic implications.
And the students who you hear about talk about also the fact that they are occasionally warned not to participate in protests, not to put anything on social media, because the repercussions for the families back in Hong Kong are severe.
That's right, and there have been lots of reports over the last few years about the footprint of two operations that China has engaged in ever since Xi Jinping came to power 10, 11 years ago. One is Operation Fox Hunt and the other one is Operation Skynet. These were originally deployed by Xi Jinping to catch people who had been accused of corruption in all sorts of far-flung places around the world. But the concern is that since then, they're also being used to try and target particular groups who face persecution from Beijing. I'm talking about, obviously, the Uyghurs from Xinjiang, people who fled to all parts of the world from places like Tibet. And if they engage in any kind of democratic activity, to try and champion their cause from outside of China, that is viewed as hostile to China, even if it's happening outside of China. And so the concern for authorities in places like the UK, in other countries around the world, is that these groups, including also Hong Kongers, are potentially being monitored, surveilled, and their families back home threatened and coerced in some fashion, either to get them to stop those activities or to coax them back to China, where they could fall into a legal oubliette, if you like, particularly with regards to these new ramping up of security laws in China that really terrified the international human rights community as well, Emma.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much, as ever, for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's programme.
This is it. The moment of truth.
A taste of Kinds of Kindness, one of the films on show at Cannes. We'll have the latest from the Côte d'Azur a little later. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
8:22 in Zurich, which is where we head next for today's newspapers, because joining me on the line is Goran Grgic, who's a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at ETH Zurich Centre for Security Studies. Good morning, Gorana.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
How's Zurich looking this morning?
Very sunny. It's going to be a beautiful and really warm spring day. So you would want to be in Zurich today and take a stroll around the lake and maybe have some apero. And but before that, we actually need to do some work.
Oh, right. OK, so before we dive straight into the Zurich Zoo for a little down at the Bardi, we'll take the papers down there, shall we? What do you want to talk about in terms of what you've spotted?
Well, I think that there are a couple of stories that I think we are all looking at and covering in different ways. And some are usually kind of top of the headlines. I think we can't go past what's been going on in terms of Russia's war against Ukraine. First of all, with the opening of this new front and these questions that are really swirling around of whether Kharkiv, which is actually the second largest city in Ukraine, might be occupied or might become the next Aleppo, as their city mayor alluded to in an interview just yesterday to the Washington Post. So there are a lot of debates as to what Russia's strategy actually at this point in time time is, whether this whole offensive on the northeast is just a distraction and they might be actually going somewhere else because some of the numbers of troops that are being deployed aren't necessarily making sense if they were actually to take over the second largest city. And then the second biggest story, the kind of reverberations of Vladimir Putin's inauguration and the fact that he decided to make a little bit of a shakeup in his cabinet and replace a longtime defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and what we could parse out of that decision. So the fact actually that the new Minister of Defense in Russia is a person who a lot of people feel is going to just double down on investments into defense industrial base in Russia. So basically telling us that Russia is truly preparing for a war of attrition and is only accelerating what we've already seen, and that's been that shift to war economy. So essentially repurposing all the sort of instruments of state to warcraft.
Let's focus a little bit on what you mentioned. It was this article in the Washington Post, which is an interview with the mayor of Kharkiv. And he said, he has this determination to keep his city free. It is not a given because Russia's attacks have changed because they have new supplies from Iran, North Korea and China. There is an existential plea, isn't there? He says his city's survival depends on our help, on the West's help.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is, again, as I said, that's the ongoing story basically since the 24th of February of 2022 as to how quickly and how much can the West equip Ukraine to be able to fend off these attacks. And as you say, what we are seeing increasingly is the ramped up coordination and collaboration, in fact, security cooperation among these four countries. We now obviously see that Russia is deploying some of the ammunition that it got from North Korea or the drones from Iran and so on. So truly, these are dire times because it seems that at least on this authoritarian side, there are no lengthy debates as the ones that we've seen, in the context of US politics, how much aid, when, and so on, the whole sort of sparring between the House Republicans and President Biden and so on. So they're much more able to deploy those weapons on the battlefield much quicker. But I also have to say that at the same time, on the Ukrainian side, you do have to admire the sort of spirit of some of these officials who are saying we are trying to maintain calm when they are facing also what we've seen all around Kharkiv in that whole region is Russia's well-tried tactics of sort of scorched earth, basically where it's not really about governance of any territories. You take over like the old way, take some territory, install governors or whoever, but it's truly what we've seen in some of the previous instances, of these fallen places where they basically burned the place to the ground. And that's something that's truly concerning. And, that sort of imagery, again, the kind of imagery of Aleppo in Syria, which we know has been more or less reduced to rebels by the Syrian regime during the war there, is something that's really concerning.
Gorana, let's move on to a story which has been dominating the headlines absolutely everywhere, and it's got a completely different tone to it. It is the fact that Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former lawyer, tried to throw his former boss under the bus yesterday. He is now a prosecution witness in Donald Trump's hush money trial. The New York Times has a very good sort of summary in the takeaways, because actually to wade through what we've been listening to isn't necessarily the most edifying experience.
No, absolutely. And I think, if you want to follow like blow by blow, who kind of coughed and sneezed and so on as they went on, I think there are now different media outlets that really are doing a good job of transcribing pretty much everything going on in that courtroom and going on now for 4 weeks already. So, I mean, long story short, or, the kind of too long didn't read that whole thread, is that we actually didn't learn anything new from Cohen's testimony so far. Basically, we know the kind of whole mechanism of how this went. Michael Cohen was actually pretty dry in laying out what happened, but it tells us this sort of story yet again that the persecution is trying to build up, and that is that Donald Trump explicitly instructed Michael Cohen to make this payment in order to influence the coverage of his campaign in 2016 to be more favorable, and obviously in doing that did things that would constitute electoral interference, given the way that these payments were set up, and later on the way that Michael Cohen was reimbursed, that has a particular implication in terms of falsifying certain business records and so on. So that's kind of the broader story. Now, I think what matters maybe for us and more broadly in terms of the whole context of the presidential campaign and the elections that are going to ensue in November of this year is that I'm not sure that this is going to at all now move the needle either way, for people who are undecided, because they're probably not paying as much attention. But it is telling of something else. And I think that is that Donald Trump has gone maybe from a person who in 2016 was still maybe a little bit ashamed of what he did and sort of worried that this was going to hurt him, compared to where we are at this very point, where Donald Trump is actually doubling down in all of the coverage of this trial or any of the other various criminal charges he's facing, where he's trying to portray himself as a victim of basically what he calls in his campaign as a witch hunt, that he's being a victim, and he's trying to really sow the seeds of distrust into any sort of verdict that is not going to be favorable to him.
Gorana Gergic, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Zurich. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, live on Monocle Radio. A quick look now at some of the other headlines we're keeping an eye on today. The Prime Minister of Georgia has vowed that a controversial so-called foreign agents bill will be passed by the country's parliament today. Opponents have staged near nightly protests against the bill, which requires organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence. Critics say the law is similar to Russian legislation, which has been used to pursue critics of Vladimir Putin. The US is expected to announce fresh trade tariffs on China, targeting areas such as electric cars, solar equipment and semiconductors. It's understood the existing tariffs set by the former President Donald Trump will be maintained, with additional measures aimed at industries the White House says are connected to strategic, competitive and national security areas. Donald Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen has told a court in New York that he conspired with his ex-boss to bury stories that could have harmed his election campaign. Mr. Cohen is a prosecution witness at the former president's hush money trial. Mr. Trump denies covering up payments made to a porn star to stop her speaking about an affair she says they had. And the European Union has lodged an official complaint with the organisers of the Eurovision Song Contest after audience members were banned from waving the bloc's flag at last Saturday's final. The complaint comes after a politician says he was denied entry to Eurovision with an EU flag. EBU rules say only flags of participating countries and the rainbow pride flags are allowed inside the venue. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, over the past few years, the number of internally displaced people, that is, people driven from their homes within their own country, has reached record highs. The Norwegian Refugee Council says that almost 76 million people were displaced last year. 2/3 of those came from just 3 conflicts: Sudan, Gaza and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, Jan Egeland is Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, and he spoke to Monocle's Chris Chermak. Chris began by asking him what makes this moment so much worse than in the past.
There are too many conflicts that are not prevented nor resolved. The old ones just keep getting worse, and then we have new cataclysmic wars like the one in Sudan, that started last year with the new Gaza war. And since then, it's been totally out of control. So 68.3 million people are today fleeing for their lives within their own country. Many become refugees, and that's an additional number. On top of that, these are people who have not been able to escape their own country, but they're fleeing because armed men, conflict, have driven them out of their homes.
Well, and to that point, this displacement really is, in this report especially, because of conflict. This is, as you say, what has gone up 50% in the last 5 years. That really is the most striking part. And on the one hand, I mean, we can draw this to a few conflicts, as you mentioned. 2/3 of these internally displaced are in Sudan, the DRC, and Gaza. But does it say something more widely about the failure of mediation as well?
Absolutely. I mean, the world is incapable of preventing war, of resolving conflict, and finding durable solutions for those people driven out of their homes. So in other words, places like Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, and Yemen have people now displaced for 10, 20 years or more. And then on top of that comes the Sudan crisis, which within 1 year displaces nearly 6 million more people because of a civil war that should have been prevented. In Gaza, the horrors of 7th of October in Israel, because led to a indiscriminate assault on Gaza, where 1.7 million people have been driven out of their homes, and many now for 5, 6, 7 times. It's many displacements within the number of displaced people.
Jan, the last time we spoke to you was from a refugee camp in Chad, and I suppose this highlights also two aspects of this when you talk about Sudan. This is a conflict that is not focused on that much around the world, but then also within that, the way you talk about the displacement within Sudan, what is being done specifically about that? Because arguably we often do focus more perhaps on those who left and refugees and less on what is needed for those that are remaining in the country where it is equally difficult, perhaps more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's not understood worldwide that 2/3 of people who flee because of violence and conflict, they remain within their own country. It's not true that everybody is fleeing to Europe and to the UK or to other Western countries. 9 out of 10 people flee within a poor country or to another poor country. So typically the Sudanese are now more than 9 million people fleeing within their own country, Sudan. In addition, increasing numbers flee to the neighboring countries, Chad, Ethiopia, Egypt, and South Sudan. But it is also true that if we don't give them support and protection and assistance and hope within their own country or in the neighboring countries, of course they will give up hope of a future where they are, and they will wander north to the Mediterranean and then try to come to Europe and places like the United Kingdom. You would have fled, I would have fled if we were in the same conditions and sought some hope for our families.
Are there unique challenges to that aspect of this? Simply the fact that we're talking about people who are internally displaced in a country or a region where often the government is not cooperating, or perhaps just the humanitarian situation itself has collapsed. What can be done about that? Is it about more humanitarian groups getting access, or is it perhaps just about finding better ways to end these civil wars?
Well, I see 3 things needs to happen. International peace diplomacy must be stronger so that there isn't wars breaking out in places like the Sudan, in Syria, in Yemen, and so on. Secondly, where there is war, there must be more efforts to resolve the conflicts so that people can return home to the places from where they fled. But thirdly, while we are unable to resolve the conflict and prevent the violence, we have to be able to give better assistance to the people who are fleeing for their lives. And today, the simple fact is that we as aid organizations have less and less funding per person who flee, per refugees and per internally displaced. We also provide less protection services, less support to them per person. And that is, of course, why so many people end up by fleeing far away, because it is their only hope of getting some support.
Just finally then, on that point, is there a challenge here sometimes in terms of there always being, sadly, a new conflict that we tend to focus on, a new group of displaced people or refugees, and then that perhaps masks the problem that is happening with so many of these conflicts, frankly, being such long simmering ones where, yes, now we've had a crisis, but really these things have been going on for decades, and that's something that needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. 45 countries on earth have people displaced internally because of violence and conflict. How many of those do we really speak about? 2 or 3, really. By the way, of those 45 countries, 43 of them also had natural disasters and climate-driven change that also displaces people. So it's a perfect storm, really. And I wish there would be more renewed attention again on Syria, on the Congo, on many countries in the Sahel, on Yemen, on Afghanistan, because it didn't get better in those places, because it got worse in Gaza and worse in Ukraine in recent years. It's just that we neglect their suffering more.
And that was Chris Chermak hearing from Jan Egeland there. You're with Monocle Radio. 9:40 a.m. in Kyiv, 8:40 a.m. in Zurich. Now, Russia's aim to cripple Ukraine's power infrastructure seems to be succeeding. Kyiv has announced it plans record electricity imports from 5 countries, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary and Moldova, sending power to Kyiv. It follows the stepping up of Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy sector. Well, Yaroslav Melek is a research fellow in energy economics and climate finance at University College London. I'm delighted to say he's in the studio. Very good morning to you, Yaroslav.
Good morning.
Just explain to us the scale of attacks that Russia has been launching on Ukraine in terms of targeting its power.
Thank you for having me this morning. So in terms of attacks, that's kind of being very interesting to observe, because if you look 1 year, 2 years before, the attacks used to focus mainly on transmission system, on distribution system, whereas in this spring, the situation completely changed. So the Russians started attacking with precise missiles on generation. So the tactics has completely changed, and the idea is basically to cut the supply of electricity, which means we'll be facing a huge deficit of electricity. So in that sense, Ukraine is forced to go to rolling blackouts. Industrial consumers will be affected by also decreased consumption over peak hours.
So there's a profound effect on daily life in Ukraine as a result of this?
Precisely. I think this has been happening for the last 2 years, but I think the scale and severity over the last 2-3 months has changed completely in terms of you have cuts of generation. And, for example, if you can restore transmission lines in a couple of days or weeks, that's not something you can easily do when you have, completely destroyed generation, because that takes, if not years, but at least months to repair.
Indeed, because we are now talking not about an immediate energy deficit, but this is something that will take the Ukrainians a very long time to get back on track. I mean, it does seem as if Russia's tactics have succeeded here.
Unfortunately, yes, they have built their capacity to attack with precision. They tried to destroy the system before to find weaknesses in it. They failed because of resilience of infrastructure and because, I would say, bravery of our transmission system repair groups who managed to address that very quickly with urgent supplies of transformators and so on. But that's not what you easily can do when your coal power plant is destroyed or your windmill is destroyed.
So tell us a little bit more about what can be done here. We have, emergency supplies coming from the likes of Moldova and Romania and Slovakia, but we also have the European Union stepping in as well. They've sent power too, haven't they?
Yes. So there are basically two obstacles. One is technical capacity to import, and here Ukraine has joined recently the European grid, but the technical capacity is limited. So anyway, Ukraine will face that deficit.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but could you explain to me how do you actually send power somewhere? Because you can't pack it up in a lorry.
Yeah, sure. So before the war, Ukraine has very limited access to the grid, but the war prompted our integration with the European Union and its power system. So now we have much more flexibility to get power from neighboring countries. But obviously there are technical infrastructure needs, which means there is limited amount of power you can actually transmit to Ukraine, which means that the entire demand in the system is much higher, actually, than that they can provide. So that's one of technical constraints. The other one is, yes, they provide emergent support. They provide not only equipment for transmission lines, but also small cogeneration units. But the problem is logistical. You can't very quickly provide that sheer amount of generation capacity that need to replace the destroyed one. So basically, in the short term, you would still face significant power outages.
And also, we will see, is there any likelihood of the cost of power being raised generally because of this?
To a certain extent, yes, but by and large, households who are the most vulnerable group, they are protected in terms of energy tariffs, so the government shields this. For industry, I think there is also a certain way to address this. So in fairness, I think Ukraine still now largely depends on liquidity support from the US, from the European Union, just to maintain daily life. And that concerns also electricity sector. So here you would have a lot of cash basically coming from the European Union just to sustain that. So obviously the Ukrainian household cannot fully afford the sheer amount of money needed to sustain. Yes.
Yaroslav Melek, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time now to talk art and culture with the arts journalist Amma Rose Abrams, who joins me in the studio now. Very good morning to you, Amma Rose. How's it going in Amma Rose's world?
Amma Rose's world's very busy at the moment.
And you're off to Photo London today?
I am. After I leave here, I'll be heading over to Photo London, which is obviously like the kind of highlight for London, the London photographic world every summer.
How big an event is it now? I mean, in the past, it's always hugely interesting, hugely exciting. Is it still that? Well, you'll find out in about 2 hours' time. But generally speaking, I mean, how much have people been anticipating this?
People do anticipate it every year because it has 120 exhibitors, and so it's a lot. You think of it as quite quite small because it's at Somerset House, which always feels so cosy. But I think they are doing quite a few interesting things this year. There's a big discovery section curated by the journalist and curator Charlotte Jansen. So I think there's a real focus on new photography, emerging photographers, and kind of that's always something really wonderful because actually it's quite difficult to see this stuff. And then there's another focus, which is female photographers throughout history. Linda Goldblatt, Sian Davey, Helen Levitt and Lee Miller. And the Photo London Master of Photography this year is Valérie Bellin. She's a French photographer. So, I mean, there's going to be a show around her work too.
You said something, it's quite difficult to see this stuff. What do you mean by that?
I find it difficult to track down great photography, especially in London. It's difficult sometimes to find places to show photography, and there are fewer photography galleries than painting, for example, and it can be more difficult to sell. So sometimes people are reluctant to show photography, but the public, the art-going public, adore photography. So I kind of, I feel like we've got the wonderful Photographers Gallery in the heart of London, but I think we could do with more spaces.
OK, if you are thinking of curating a space, ring Emma Rose because she wants more photographs, please. It's an interesting thing that you have also historic and vintage works, which are always a total thrill to see.
Wonderful, because you think about the use of the technology, really. It's so young, and you think about these daguerreotypes and different techniques of printing and how much it's changed, and then film and digital, and just seeing it all laid out is fascinating because you can see it in the work.
Right, let us move on to... I got an email yesterday from someone at Christie's telling me not to worry, but that everything had been hacked. And I had no idea what was going on there. So you're going to have to help us. You're going to have to help me and everybody else who wants to know what on earth has happened to Christie's computer system.
It's not an email you want to receive, is it?
Not dreadfully, but it didn't seem wildly relevant to my world. So I sort of just read it out of interest, and I'm glad you brought it up.
It's very, very strange story whereby, because it's just ahead of their sale. So their sale's in New York, and it's like apparently an $840 million sale.
What's in it?
Series of sales, lots of different, like a huge array of work. So contemporary and modern, and kind of. So just ahead of these sales, the website goes down, and it goes down in a quite strange way. You know how with a hack there might be like that kind of jumping cat or some kind of like mad laughing noise, and there was nothing like that. It was just directed you to a landing page with an email address that I hope nobody sent an email to.
See, that to me sounds like the most Christie style hack that you could ever have.
Exactly.
It's done in a very understated and elegant way.
Yeah, quite classy.
Classy hack here. It's not funny though, but go on. So what happened next?
What happened next was there was just quite an enigmatic statement from Christie saying that that it impacted some of their systems and they were taking all necessary steps to manage the matter. So it's all quite kind of opaque. I'm not sure what happened, and I'm not sure what was extracted in the hack, or if anything was extracted. So I guess we will find out down the line.
Because we do have we have huge amounts of money being transferred and moved around.
Enormous. Via the site. People can shop through the site. They can bid on the auctions via the site. And they can also peruse ahead of these massive sales. What collectors will be doing is kind of seeing what's on offer and comparing notes and things like that. And I guess in taking the site down, it meant that nobody could do that on the most basic level. I am wondering, though, what else happened during that time.
OK. We may never find out. Let's move to New York. There's an independent art fair, which is actually doing rather well in a time where I think it has to be agreed that the art world at the moment is quite tricky, isn't it?
It's struggling. Everything feels like a bit of a punt at the moment. Like nobody really knows what's going to happen. Some things do well, most things kind of don't. So kind of it's been a little bit iffy. But New York's independent art fair, because it's like a younger fair with a lower price point. The highest price point was $115,000, which obviously is a colossal amount of money, but not really in the art world. And they did really, really well. Lots of booths sold out. It sounds like a story of about 5 years ago, where with selling out booths and drama on the kind of like people outbidding each other and things like that. And so, for an independent to be doing that well, maybe signals a slight upturn, and also maybe signals people being interested in art of a different price point for a different reason, like rather than just buying things to flip. Maybe it's a bit more nuanced approach.
You mean that people are actually buying art to enjoy?
Maybe.
Goodness me. Emma Rose Abrams, enjoy Photo London. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. 7:52 here in London, 8:52 if you're listening in the south of France, which is where we head now, because the Cannes Film Festival rolls out the red carpet today. Filmmakers are launching their work in possibly one of the most turbulent periods in a very, very long time. So to bring us absolutely everything, I'm delighted to say that joining us on the line from Cannes is the film critic Karen Krasanovic. Good morning. How's Cannes looking?
It's well, I just had to close the windows because the bin men are out. But it's looking very sleek and very good. We're waiting for 35,000 people to descend on this small village. And the place looks pretty good, actually, I have to say.
Good to hear it, and glad to hear that the bin men are doing their job as well. What is the tone being set at Cannes this year?
Well, that's a good question. We're getting the feeling it's going to be quite a vigorous Cannes. I think, we've got an interesting jury. We've got Greta Gerwig, Lily Gladstone, Eva Green. I mean, there's a lot of women on the primary jury, which I think is a really good sign. And also, there's some very exciting films. There's the big red carpet for Furiosa is going to be in a couple of days. That's the George Miller follow-up to Mad Max Fury Road. And also Megalopolis, the self-funded epic by Francis Ford Coppola. So there is a lot of sort of Hollywood excitement along with all of the European and other global titles here.
Indeed. I mean, we have, you mentioned Coppola there, but we have some enormous Hollywood names coming, don't we? We have Meryl Streep, for starters.
Meryl Streep is doing a Q&A. They do this. They did this with Tom Cruise as well and Mads Mikkelsen. They just come in and drag these great stars in, and you get to yap at them for a couple hours. I feel sorry for the stars, frankly, but it's always great fun, and it gives them terrific coverage. And I think that's really important. And also, I can't remember the last time Meryl Streep was here.
I mean, we have other names such as Richard Gere, Kevin Costner. I mean, is there a sort of dare I say it, it's sort of slightly retro?
It feels very retro. And another thing they're pushing, I think it's more promoted more than previous years, is the Cannes Classics, where they revamp films that you love. And they're very available. For example, I'm going to see Seven Samurai and also Abel Gance's Napoleon, which I've seen both of them quite a few times. But I'm going to go again because I want to see the revamped version. We also have Donald Trump. As acted by Sebastian Stan in Ali Abbasi's The Apprentice. And that's not this week, that's next week. And that's another thing that's going to kick off the second part of this almost 2-week festival.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this that people are showing their work in some of the most turbulent periods in a very long time, both internally in terms of what's happening in the film world and people going on strike and accusations flying around, but also externally in terms of conflict and politically charged events.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of politically charged films here as well. I mean, they don't shy away from that kind of thing here. There's films about Gaza and Israel as well. And so we're going to see what happens there, if there's going to be any. There's always a protest on the red carpet. There's always some kind of statement. They can't seem to stop it. Generally, it doesn't break out into any kind of violence. But, Cannes tries to embrace everything as best it can. And I think it does quite a good job.
So tell us how it's going to sort of navigate all of this, because, let's touch on the war in Gaza, because France has very large Jewish and very large Arab communities.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think they're just going to try and be very even-handed about it. And don't forget, if you haven't been to the Cannes Film Festival before, they don't have them out now, but they will very soon. They've got barricades up in the streets. I mean, they do every year. It doesn't matter what's going on. So they do have a police presence, and they do know how to handle these kind of things. So it's not going to be running amok with a riot or anything like that, even though they will have thousands of people here. There are more than 600 hospitality employees as well. So they're also going to be trained in that kind of crowd management.
And tell us a little bit more about the fact that the French film industry itself is experiencing moments of trouble too.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, the French film industry is always in some sort of throes of trying to get their films seen. Or, I mean, well, Cannes is not, I mean, it is, of course, the center of the French film industry, but it's also a precursor to the Oscars. And I think trying to get your film here is never an easy thing. So we shall have to see what is going to transpire and which films are going to come out. You know, you look at this list of titles, and it could be absolutely anything. Kinds of Kindness, L'amour ouf, Grand Tour. Who knows what's going to win?
Karen Krasanovic, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Cannes. You're listening to The Globalist, and that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Vincent McAviney, Chris Chermak and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London, and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.